What makes a person the most important monarch in modern history? Is it power, duty, or a life of personal sacrifice? That's exactly what this story is about. Before we dive in, I want to ask you something. Do you think Elizabeth II lived a truly happy life, or was it more of a life defined by responsibility and sacrifice? Be sure to write your opinion in the comments. I'm curious to see how you see it. If you are interested in such stories about history, power, and real human destinies, then support the video with a like and subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss anything. Because what follows now is more than just the biography of a queen. It is the story of a woman who has shaped not only one country, but the entire world for 7 decades, a story full of a sense of duty, change, and quiet strength. Chapter 1: The Birth of a Future Queen. On April 21, 1926, a girl was born in an elegant house in London's Mayfair district, whom no one thought was a future queen at the time. She is given the name Elizabeth II Alexandra Mary, a name that carries tradition and history. But despite this sonorous connection to the monarchy, her birth is not initially an earth-shattering event. She is not the direct heir to the throne. Her life seems to be mapped out as that of a high-ranking but ultimately secondary princess within the royal family. Her father, George VI, then known as Prince Albert, is the second son of King George V. This means that the throne is actually intended for his older brother, Edward VIII. So there is no immediate reason for little Elizabeth to be prepared for a future reign. Her life begins in a world that is characterized by protocol and tradition, but at the same time seems surprisingly private and familiar. Her mother, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, ensures that her daughter experiences a loving and comparatively down-to-earth childhood. Within the family, Elizabeth is affectionately called Lilibet, a nickname that arises from her own childlike inability to pronounce her name correctly. This name later becomes a symbol of her personal side, which only a few people really get to see. It becomes clear early on that Elizabeth is no ordinary child. She is calm, attentive, and possesses remarkable self-discipline. While other children are loud and playful, she often seems thoughtful, almost serious, as if she instinctively senses that her life could one day be of greater importance. Nevertheless, her childhood is not free of lightness. She spends a lot of time with her younger sister Margaret, with whom she develops a close, albeit later complicated, relationship. A large part of her early years took place far away from the public eye. Unlike today's members of the royal family, Elizabeth is growing up in a time when the media does not yet accompany every step. Photographs are rare, interviews practically non-existent. This allows her to achieve a certain normality, at least within the extraordinary circumstances into which she was born. Your home is characterized by structure and a sense of duty, but also by warmth. Especially her father, who is often described as shy and sensitive, develops a deep bond with his daughter. This relationship will be crucial later on, as Elizabeth adopts many of his values, a sense of duty, restraint, and a deep loyalty to the crown. Their training is largely private. Governesses teach her history, languages, and constitutional law, an unusual focus for a young girl who does not yet officially have a role as a future monarch. But already here it becomes clear that her upbringing is more than that of an ordinary princess. It's like carefully preparing them for something that no one can yet clearly name. Her interest in history and the British Constitution is particularly formative. These topics not only fascinate her, she takes them seriously. While other children may learn because they have to, Elizabeth seems to understand why this knowledge is important. It is an early indication of the sense of duty that will later determine their entire lives. But despite all these qualities, she initially remains a child who lives in a world that seems stable and predictable. The monarchy seems unshakable, the roles are clearly divided, and the future seems fixed. No one, neither her family nor the public, suspects that this apparent security will soon change dramatically. It was in these early years that Elizabeth also developed her first passions. Horses play a central role in her life, a love that will accompany her into old age. Riding gives her a feeling of freedom, far away from protocol and expectations. It's one of the few areas where she can just be herself, without the burden of a royal name. At the same time, she begins to develop a deep understanding of responsibility, albeit initially in small, everyday things. It takes its tasks seriously, no matter how insignificant they may seem. This attitude later becomes one of its most distinctive features, the ability to recognize dignity and importance even in the smallest duties. The world around them is in a state of change. The aftermath of the First World War is still noticeable, social structures are changing, and the role of the monarchy is increasingly being questioned. But all this remains in the background for the young Elizabeth for the time being. Their world is still manageable, protected and characterized by family closeness. It is precisely this mixture of tradition, stability, and subliminal change that shapes her childhood. She is growing up in a time that stands between the past and the future, between old values and new challenges. And although she is not yet at the center of the story at this point, she is already becoming part of a larger narrative that slowly unfolds. Looking back, her childhood almost seems like the quiet phase before a storm. Everything seems orderly, predictable, and safe. But it is precisely this apparent calm that makes what is to follow all the more drastic. Because the girl who is born here, far away from expectations, far away from the direct claim to the throne, will soon be pushed into a role that will change her entire life. A role that she did not choose, but which she will fill with a determination that will shape the world for decades to come. Chapter 1 therefore ends not with a climax, but with a faint premonition that this seemingly ordinary royal child will one day become the most extraordinary monarch of her time. Chapter 2: The abdication that changes everything. Sometimes history is decided not by wars or revolutions, but by personal choices, quiet, human moments that have more far-reaching consequences than anyone can initially comprehend. For the young Elizabeth II, such a moment is the year 1936. A year that will change her life forever, although she herself is still far too young to fully understand the implications. Up to this point, her life has been quiet. The succession to the throne seems to be clearly regulated. After the death of King George V, his eldest son, Edward VIII, ascends the throne. For Elizabeth, this means continuing to live in the background of the monarchy. She is the daughter of a prince, not the future queen. Their role is important, but not central. Her fate seems predetermined, just not on the throne. But behind the walls of Buckingham Palace, a crisis begins to build up that will soon shake the entire kingdom. Edward VIII is no ordinary king. Charismatic, modern, and unconventional, he stands for a new kind of monarchy. But it is precisely these qualities that bring him into conflict with the strict expectations placed on a British king. At the center of this crisis is a woman, Wallis Simpson, a divorced American woman with whom Edward falls madly in love. For him, the decision is clear: he wants to marry her. For the establishment, the government, and the church, however, this relationship is incompatible with his role as king. A British monarch is not only head of state, but also head of the Anglican Church, and marriage to a divorced woman is considered unacceptable. What follows is one of the biggest constitutional crises in British history. Behind closed doors, there are discussions, negotiations, and arguments. Prime ministers, advisors, and family members try to change Edward's mind. They warn him of the consequences, appeal to his duty. But Edward makes a decision that will change everything. On December 11, 1936, he spoke the words that made history: he abdicated. In a radio address, he explains that he cannot govern without the woman he loves. It is a moment of extraordinary personal honesty, but also a break with centuries of royal tradition. It is a scandal for the world, a crisis for the monarchy, and for little Elizabeth, it is the beginning of a completely new life. Because with Edward's abdication, the crown passes to his younger brother, Elizabeth's father, George VI. A man who never wanted to be king, who sees himself as rather reserved and insecure, suddenly finds himself at the center of power. And with him, his daughter also comes into focus. From one day to the next, Elizabeth's position changes fundamentally. She is no longer just a princess. She is now the direct heir to the throne. A child who yesterday led a relatively carefree life suddenly carries a future on his shoulders that is characterized by responsibility and duty. For Elizabeth herself, this change happens almost imperceptibly at first. There is no dramatic proclamation, no moment in which the whole truth is revealed to her. But she senses that something has changed. The atmosphere becomes more serious. Expectations are rising. The people around her behave differently. Her father in particular is now under enormous pressure. George VI struggles not only with the sudden responsibility, but also with personal insecurities, especially his well-known language problem. Public speaking becomes a challenge that he can only overcome with great discipline and support. For Elizabeth, he becomes a silent role model during this time, a man who does not deny his fears, but faces them, out of duty to his country. This attitude has a deep impact on her. She observes, learns, and begins to understand what it means to take on a role not out of free will, but out of responsibility. It's a lesson she'll never forget. Her mother, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, also plays a crucial role in this transitional period. She recognizes early on what the new situation means for her daughter and ensures that Elizabeth is carefully but consistently prepared for her future role. It's not just about knowledge or etiquette, it's about attitude, dignity, and the ability to show strength even in difficult times. However, Edward VIII's abdication does not only have an impact within the royal family. It also changes the relationship between the monarchy and the public. People's trust has been shaken. Questions are raised. What does it mean to be king? Where is the boundary between personal happiness and public duty? For Elizabeth, this discussion grows into a silent background noise, something she may not yet fully understand, but which nevertheless becomes part of her world. She grows up aware that her role is not only a privilege, but also an obligation. At the same time, she loses a bit of light-heartedness. The freedom to simply be a child is increasingly restricted. Deadlines, expectations, and preparation for future tasks are increasing. But instead of resisting them, Elizabeth seems to embrace these changes with remarkable calm. It's as if she instinctively understands that her life doesn't belong to her alone. The relationship with her uncle Edward remains complex. For the public, he becomes a controversial figure, but for Elizabeth, he remains a family member. Nevertheless, his decision is symbolic of a path that she will never take herself. Where he chooses love and gives up the crown, she will later do exactly the opposite, put her personal desires behind duty. This juxtaposition becomes an invisible leitmotif of her life. With her father's coronation in 1937, the new reality finally became visible. Elizabeth is now the center of attention, not as a queen, but as a future one. Every step she takes, every gesture she makes, is observed. The world is beginning to take an interest in this young girl who will one day be the face of the monarchy. And yet, at least outwardly, she remains the same child as before, calm, disciplined, and surprisingly composed. Perhaps this is precisely where their greatest strength lies, the ability to adapt to change without losing themselves. Chapter 2 is therefore not only the story of an abdication. It is the story of a turning point, a moment in which the fate of a family and an entire country is reshaped. For Elizabeth, it is the moment when a possible future becomes an inevitable destiny. A path that she did not choose, but which she will follow step by step from now on. And while the world is still talking about scandals and headlines, a young girl in the background is already quietly preparing for a role that will one day make her the most famous woman in the world. Chapter 3: Childhood in the Shadow of War. When the political situation in Europe became increasingly acute towards the end of the 1930s, the life of the young Elizabeth II began to change again. What at first seems like distant news from other countries soon becomes a reality that even the walls of royal residences can no longer keep away. The Second World War is imminent, and with it a time that not only shakes nations, but also shapes the childhood of a girl who will one day become queen. In 1939, Great Britain declares war on Nazi Germany. For most people, this means fear, insecurity, and deprivation. For Elizabeth, it means one thing above all: the loss of the last remnants of a carefree childhood. She is just 13 years old when her life finally differs from that of other children. The danger of air strikes on London is growing rapidly. German bombs regularly hit the capital. Entire districts were destroyed, families torn apart. In this situation, it is decided that Elizabeth and her younger sister Margaret should be evacuated for safety reasons. Many children from London are sent to the countryside in an attempt to protect them from the worst effects of the war. A safe place is also being sought for the two princesses. After all, they spend a large part of the war years at Windsor Castle, outside London. But although they are geographically removed from the immediate danger, the war remains omnipresent. Sirens, news and reports of destruction penetrate to them. It is a childhood marked by uncertainty, even behind thick castle walls. During this time, one of Elizabeth's most defining qualities became apparent: her ability to maintain her composure even in difficult situations. While many children are overwhelmed by fear, she seems composed, almost calm. This does not mean that she is not afraid, but rather that she learns early on not to show it to the outside world. Her family plays a decisive role in this. Her father, George VI, deliberately decides not to leave London, even though the danger is great. Together with his wife, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, he remains in the capital, a strong signal to the population. The royal family shares the fate of their people instead of fleeing to safety. This decision has a deep impact on Elizabeth. She realizes that leadership doesn't mean protecting yourself, but being present, especially in difficult times. It is a lesson that she will later implement consistently as queen. Despite the distance, the connection between Elizabeth and her parents remains close. Regular visits and conversations help to keep the family together. But the reality of the war cannot be ignored. Elizabeth begins to understand that her role is more than that of an observer. She is part of a symbol that is supposed to give people hope. A particularly significant moment in this period occurred in 1940. At just 14 years old, Elizabeth gives her first public speech on the radio. In the show, she addresses children who, like herself, have been evacuated or are suffering from the consequences of the war. Her words are simple but powerful. She speaks of courage, cohesion, and hope for better times. For many listeners, this speech is more than just a message, it is a sign. A young girl, herself affected by the circumstances, speaks with a maturity far beyond her age. It is the first moment in which the public gets a glimpse of who Elizabeth could be one day. This experience changes her. She realizes that her voice carries weight, that her words can reach people. At the same time, their awareness of the responsibility that comes with it is growing. It's no longer just a game or an exercise, it's part of their future role. As the war continues, Elizabeth becomes increasingly active. She participates in smaller support campaigns, learns practical skills, and shows interest in how she can help in concrete terms. Towards the end of the war, she even joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, a women's division of the British Army. There she is trained as a driver and mechanic, an unusual role for a princess, but a strong symbol of her commitment. This experience is more than just a symbolic act. She brings Elizabeth closer to the reality of the people who live with the effects of war on a daily basis. She learns what it means to be part of a larger whole, not as an observer, but as a contributor. At the same time, her character continues to develop. The war forces them to grow up faster. Decisions that would normally be made years later are suddenly within reach. Responsibility is no longer abstract, it is part of their everyday lives. The relationship with her sister Margaret offers an important emotional balance during this time. Together, they try to preserve moments of normality despite the circumstances. They play, laugh, and share their thoughts, small islands of childhood in the middle of a world in a state of emergency. But even these moments are overshadowed by the reality of war. The constant presence of danger, loss, and uncertainty cannot be completely ignored. Elizabeth learns early on that life is not always fair or predictable. When the war finally ended in 1945, Elizabeth was 19 years old. The years of conflict have shaped her, not only as a future queen, but as a person. She is more mature, determined, and has a deep understanding of the importance of duty and cohesion. The moment of the end of the war is marked by relief and joy. People are celebrating on the streets of London. The mood is exuberant. Elizabeth and Margaret also mingle unrecognized with the crowd that evening, a rare moment in which they can be part of the crowd instead of standing above it. For Elizabeth, it is an experience she will never forget, the feeling of simply being one person among many. Looking back, Chapter 3 is more than just the story of a childhood in war. It is the story of a development, from a protected girl to a young woman who begins to understand her role in the world. The war takes away part of her innocence, but it also gives her something back: clarity. Clarity about who she is, what is expected of her, and how she wants to meet these expectations. At a time when many are breaking down, she grows with the challenges. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, steadily, and with an inner strength that will later become her trademark. And so this chapter ends not only with the end of a war, but with the beginning of a new phase in Elizabeth's life. A phase in which she is no longer just prepared, but begins to actively fulfill her role. Chapter 4: A young princess finds her role. After the end of the Second World War, a new phase of life begins for the young Elizabeth II. The world is rebuilding, Europe is still in ruins in many parts, and Great Britain is also struggling with the consequences of the difficult years. But while society slowly reorganizes, Elizabeth stands on the threshold between youth and adulthood, and above all at the beginning of her conscious role within the monarchy. The war has changed them. The reserved girl has become a young woman who understands her responsibility, perhaps not in all its political dimensions, but in its human meaning. She has seen what uncertainty, fear, and loss mean. And she has learned that her position is more than a title. It is a symbol. In the years after 1945, her education began to reach a new depth. She is being prepared more intensively than ever before for her future role. It is no longer just about classical education such as history or languages. The focus shifts to constitutional law, constitutional issues, and international relations. Elizabeth should understand how her country works, not only as a monarch, but as part of a complex political system. Her training remains unusual. She does not attend school in the classic sense, has no classmates or everyday social experiences as other young people know. Their learning takes place in a private setting, under the guidance of selected teachers and counselors. There are two sides to this isolation. On the one hand, it lacks a bit of normality, and on the other hand, it allows for extraordinarily targeted preparation. Her growing understanding of the British Constitution is particularly formative. She learns that the power of the monarchy does not lie in direct political influence, but in stability, continuity, and representation. It is a role that requires restraint and presence at the same time. A balancing act that she begins to understand early on. At the same time, their practical training is also increasing. Elizabeth accompanies her father, George VI, on more and more official occasions. In the beginning there are smaller appointments, later also larger events. She observes closely how he talks to people, how he moves, how he makes decisions. For them, these moments are more than just performances, they are lessons. George VI became her most important role model in these years. His way of showing strength despite personal insecurities impresses her deeply. Especially his discipline and sense of duty leave a lasting impression. Elizabeth realizes that leadership does not mean perfection, but the willingness to take responsibility, even when it is difficult. Her mother, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, also continues to play a central role. She teaches her daughter the importance of emotional intelligence, the ability to understand people, show closeness, and maintain dignity at the same time. This mixture of warmth and restraint later becomes a trademark of Elizabeth. With increasing age, public attention also grows. The young princess is photographed more and more often, her appearances are commented on, her personality begins to interest people. She becomes a figure with whom many identify, especially at a time when stability and hope are desperately needed. But with this attention comes expectations. Every gesture, every word is observed. Mistakes that would hardly be noticed by others can have a greater effect on her. Elizabeth learns early on to control herself, to act thoughtfully, and to be aware of her effect. An important milestone in this phase is the year 1947. Elizabeth is 21 years old, an age that is traditionally considered the entry into adult life. On a trip to South Africa, she gives a speech that is later considered one of the most significant moments of her early life. In this speech, she makes a promise. She declares that she will dedicate her whole life, whether short or long, to the service of her people. It is not a political statement, but a personal pledge. And yet it carries enormous importance. These words are not spontaneous. They reflect everything she has learned in the years before. Duty, responsibility, dedication. All of this condenses into a clear attitude at this moment. For many people, this speech becomes proof that Elizabeth is ready for what lies ahead. But while her public role is becoming clearer, her private life is also evolving. One of the most important relationships of her life takes shape during this time, the connection to Prince Philip. The two had already met years earlier, but now an acquaintance becomes a deeper connection. Philip, a young officer with a strong character and a will of his own, differs from Elizabeth in many ways. While she is calm and thoughtful, he often comes across as direct and energetic. But it is precisely these differences that seem to attract them. Their relationship does not develop without challenges. There are concerns within the royal family. Philip comes from a European noble family that has lost influence due to political upheaval. In addition, his personality is seen as unconventional, not necessarily what you imagine for the future husband of a queen. But Elizabeth remains determined. For her, Philip is more than just a suitable match. He is someone who understands her, who makes her laugh, and who is willing to accompany her on her way. Her decision to marry him is one of the few that she really makes herself. This connection gives her support at a time when her life is increasingly determined by expectations. She finds a partner in Philip who not only supports her, but also challenges her. Someone who does not shy away from their role, but is willing to find their place at their side. As her personal future becomes more concrete, her public role is also becoming more and more intense. She takes on more tasks, travels more often, and is increasingly perceived as a future queen. The transition phase between princess and monarch has begun, even if no one knows exactly when it will end. Despite all these changes, Elizabeth remains remarkably consistent in her nature. She is not loud, not impulsive, not looking for attention. Instead, she seems controlled, disciplined, and goal-oriented, qualities that are becoming increasingly important in a rapidly changing world. Chapter 4 thus shows a crucial period in her life, the moment when preparation becomes reality. Elizabeth begins not only to understand her role, but to actively fill it. She becomes visible, not only as the king's daughter, but as an independent personality. It is a phase of transition, characterized by learning, growth, and important decisions. A time when the foundations for everything that will follow are laid. Because as the world continues to change, Elizabeth inexorably approaches the moment when she herself will be the center of attention. She is still a princess. She still has time to learn, to observe, to grow. But this time is limited. And soon she will have to face a reality that no longer allows for preparation, only responsibility. Chapter 5 Love and Duty, the wedding with Philip. In a world shaped by tradition, expectations, and clearly defined roles, there often seems to be little room for feelings, especially when it comes to the future of a monarchy. But it is precisely in this field of tension that one of the most personal and at the same time most important stories of her life begins to unfold for the young Elizabeth II, her relationship with Prince Philip. Their first meeting was a few years ago. Elizabeth is still a young girl when she first consciously perceives Philip. He is older, self-confident, and with his direct manner, seems very different from most of the men around her. For Elizabeth, who grows up in a strictly regulated world, this informality has a special attraction. Over the years, this early encounter develops into a more intense connection. Letters are exchanged, meetings take place, initially as part of official events, later also in person. As Elizabeth grows older and increasingly understands her role as future queen, her affection for Philip grows at the same time. For them, it is not a fleeting infatuation, but a serious decision of the heart. But this is exactly where the conflict begins. Because a marriage within the royal family is never just a private matter. It is political, symbolic, and of enormous public importance. Every decision is examined, every connection evaluated. And Philip has qualities that are not universally approved. He comes from a European aristocratic family with Greek and Danish roots, an origin marked by political upheaval and exile. His family has gone through difficult times, and not all connections are considered unproblematic in the context of the British monarchy. Philip is also known for his direct, sometimes impulsive nature, something that doesn't necessarily fit with the traditional expectations of a royal consort. There are therefore reservations within the palace. Counselors and family members express concerns, ask questions, weigh up. Is it suitable? Will he be able to adapt? Can he accept the role that will inevitably be overshadowed by his wife? For Elizabeth, however, the answer is clear. She sees in Philip not only the man she loves, but also a partner who is strong enough to walk this extraordinary path with her. Someone who not only stands by their side, but also supports them without giving up on themselves. In a world where many decisions are made for her, this is one of the few where she is in charge. This determination shows a new side of her. The quiet, reserved princess suddenly proves a firm will. She is willing to stand up for her decision, even if she meets resistance. Her father, George VI, also has mixed feelings about this relationship at first. He loves his daughter very much and wants to protect her, both personally and in her future role. But he also realizes how serious she is. Over time, he begins to get to know Philip better and see his qualities. Finally, he gives his consent. This consent is more than just a formal permission. It is a sign of confidence in Elizabeth's judgment and in Philip's ability to take on the challenges of this special role. The engagement was officially announced in 1947. The reaction of the public is overwhelmingly positive. After the difficult years of war, people are longing for hope, for positive news, and a royal wedding offers just that. On November 20th, 1947, the wedding took place in Westminster Abbey. It is an event of national importance. Millions of people watch the ceremony, either on site or via radio broadcasts. In a time of reconstruction, this wedding becomes a symbol of a new beginning. Elizabeth appears in an elegant dress that has been designed with great care despite the rationing that is still in place. Many materials are scarce, but the dress becomes a masterpiece, a sign that beauty and hope can find their place even in difficult times. Philip, who is given the title Duke of Edinburgh before the wedding, stands by her side. For him, this marriage means not only love, but also a profound cut in his own life. He gives up a lot of personal freedoms, adapts to expectations, and accepts a role that is not the center of attention. This willingness is crucial, because the dynamics of their relationship are characterized by a special balance from the beginning. Elizabeth as the future queen, Philip as a supportive partner, but also as an independent personality. The first years of their marriage are marked by a mixture of normality and extraordinary circumstances. They try to build a life together, spend time together, and experience moments that are natural for many couples, and yet for them are always overshadowed by their role. It is a phase of relative calm before her life will change fundamentally again. But even in these quieter moments, the future remains present. Elizabeth knows that her time as a princess is limited. The responsibility that awaits them is inescapable. And Philip knows that his role will evolve, from a husband to a prince consort at the side of a queen. Despite these challenges, their relationship seems stable. It is based not only on affection, but also on mutual respect and understanding. Both know that they are in a unique situation, and that they can only survive together. Chapter 5 is therefore more than just the story of a royal wedding. It is the story of a decision between personal happiness and public responsibility. And unlike other moments in Elizabeth's life, it's a decision she makes herself. A decision for love. But this love does not exist in isolation from its duty. She becomes part of it, embedded in a role that is bigger than any personal relationship. This is precisely the strength of this connection. It does not exist in spite of the challenges, but precisely because of them. As the world celebrates and the future seems hopeful, no one has any idea how quickly everything will change. Just a few years later, Elizabeth will face a reality that will definitively define her role. And then it will become clear whether this connection is strong enough to carry not only love, but also the burden of a crown. Chapter 6: The Unexpected Rise to Queen. Elizabeth II's life has always been marked by responsibility, but at the beginning of the 1950s, it seems that she still has time. Time to continue to prepare, gain experience, and grow into their future role step by step. But fate doesn't follow a fixed plan, and sometimes the moment you're prepared for comes much sooner than expected. After her wedding to Prince Philip, Elizabeth initially begins a phase that almost seems like an attempt at normality. The young couple spends time together, lives temporarily in Malta, where Philip is stationed as a naval officer, and experiences moments that many couples take for granted: evenings together, travels, an everyday life that is not completely determined by royal duties. For Elizabeth, this time is particularly precious. It is one of the few phases of her life in which she allows herself a bit of freedom, far away from the direct center of the monarchy. She is a wife, later also a mother, and can at least begin to lead a life that is not defined exclusively by expectations. But even in these quieter years, reality remains present. Her father, George VI, is increasingly struggling with health problems. The stress of recent years, especially during the war, has left its mark. His strength is waning, and although the public does not immediately realize the full extent, it is clear within the family that something is changing. Elizabeth begins to take on more commitments. She represents her father on official occasions, travels in his name, and increasingly appears as a central figure of the monarchy. It is not an abrupt change, but a gradual transition, but the direction is clear. With every appointment, every speech, and every trip, their experience grows, and at the same time the expectations placed on them. In 1952, Elizabeth and Philip are scheduled to visit several countries in the Commonwealth, including Kenya. It is a trip with great symbolic significance. It is intended to strengthen the link between Britain and its international partners, while showing that a new generation is ready to take responsibility. At this time, Elizabeth is 25 years old. The journey starts promisingly. The mood is positive. The encounters are cordial. In Kenya, the couple spends a few days in an idyllic setting, a moment of peace, almost like a last break before everything changes. Because while she is in Africa, her father's condition deteriorates dramatically. On February 6, 1952, George VI died at the age of only 56. The news does not reach Elizabeth immediately. It is a moment that is both private and historical at the same time, the death of a father and the beginning of a new era. When the news is finally delivered, her life changes in a single moment. Elizabeth is no longer just a princess. She is queen. There is no transition, no delay. The British monarchy never knows a moment without a sovereign. The moment her father dies, she automatically takes over the crown. Without preparation for this concrete moment, without saying goodbye, without time to process what happened. The young woman, who was still on the road as a daughter and wife a few hours earlier, now bears responsibility for an entire kingdom. The return journey to Great Britain takes place under completely different auspices. When Elizabeth leaves, she is a princess. When she returns, she is queen. This transition, so abrupt, so final, has a deep impact on her. When she arrives, she is confronted with a reality that knows no break. Protocols start immediately, decisions have to be made, appointments have to be organized, conversations have to be held. The mourning for her father must be reconciled with her duty as monarch. And this is exactly where one of her greatest strengths becomes apparent: her ability to put personal feelings aside without denying them. Elizabeth is grieving, but at the same time she fulfills her role. She takes on responsibility, talks to consultants, begins to familiarize herself with her new position. It is not a spectacular transition, not a dramatic appearance. It is calm, controlled, and carried by a deep sense of duty. Everything changes for Prince Philip as well. His role is changing fundamentally. He is no longer just a husband, but the man at the Queen's side, a position that brings its own challenges. He has to reorient himself, put his own ambitions on the back burner, and at the same time take on a supporting role. For both, a phase of adaptation begins. The young Queen is now at the center of the world's attention. Every step is observed, every decision is analyzed. Expectations are enormous, not only within the UK, but also internationally. In a time of political change, the Cold War and the dissolution of old structures, stability becomes a decisive factor. And it is precisely this stability that she is supposed to embody. Elizabeth does not meet this task with grand gestures, but with consistency. She adheres to protocols, respects traditions, and at the same time shows a certain openness to the changes of her time. It is a balancing act that requires tact. She is aware that she doesn't have to be perfect, but reliable. The first months of her reign were marked by learning. She talks to politicians, studies documents, and seeks advice. In particular, the weekly meetings with the Prime Minister become a central part of her work. Here she gains insight into political developments, asks questions, and develops an understanding of the complex interrelationships that shape her country. At the same time, she begins to find her own way of filling this role. She doesn't just copy her father, but develops her own style step by step, characterized by calmness, discipline, and a strong sense of continuity. The public reacts with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Many people see her as a young modern queen who at the same time preserves the values of the past. In a time of upheaval, it becomes a symbol of permanence. Chapter 6 is therefore not only the story of an unexpected ascension. It is the story of a moment in which preparation meets reality. A moment that shows that it is not the timing that is decisive, but the way in which it is encountered. Elizabeth does not become queen by a decision. It becomes so through an event that it cannot control. But how she reacts to it is entirely up to her. And that's exactly where their strength lies. She accepts this role, not with enthusiasm, not with resistance, but with a deep understanding of what it means. She accepts that her life has changed irrevocably and begins to walk this new path. Without hesitation, without evasion, with a sense of duty, and with the quiet determination to do justice to this task. Chapter 7, The Coronation, A New Age Begins. When Elizabeth II became queen in February 1952, it happened quietly, almost invisible to the public. No solemn moment, no great ceremonial accompanies this transition, only the death of her father and the immediate assumption of a role that allows no delay. But while her ascension to the throne is abrupt, an event is yet to come that will make this new reality visible: her coronation. The months following the death of George VI are marked by preparation, adaptation, and growing expectation. The young queen not only has to settle into her role, but also plan an event that goes far beyond personal significance. The coronation is not a private ritual, it is a national and international symbol. A moment that makes the connection between monarchy, tradition, and people visible. The date is set for June 2, 1953. More than a year has passed between her accession to the throne and this event. This time is necessary, not only for organizational preparations, but also to give the public the opportunity to get used to the new queen. Elizabeth uses these months intensively. She continues to familiarize herself with her tasks, studies the procedures of the ceremony, and prepares for each step. Because the coronation is not an easy act. It follows a centuries-old ritual that dates back to the Middle Ages. Every movement, every word, every gesture is fixed. It is a ceremony full of symbolism, marked by religious elements, historical insignia, and a process that leaves little room for improvisation. For Elizabeth, this means not only preparation, but also a deep understanding of the significance of this moment. She is aware that she is not only the center of attention as a person, but as the embodiment of an institution that goes far beyond her. On the day of the coronation, thousands of people gather in the streets of London. Millions of people around the world are following the event. It's a time when television is becoming increasingly important, and it's here that Elizabeth makes a decision that is considered bold and modern. It allows the ceremony to be broadcast live on television. For many within the establishment, this is a risky step. The coronation is considered sacred, something that should not be made fully public. But Elizabeth realizes that the world has changed. People want to participate, see, understand, and feel connected. This decision marks a turning point. For the first time, such an event will be broadcast into people's living rooms. Families gather in front of their televisions, watching every moment, every movement. The monarchy, which for a long time was distant and difficult to access, suddenly becomes visible. The ceremony itself takes place at Westminster Abbey, a place deeply linked to the history of the British monarchy. When Elizabeth enters the church, she is not only wearing a magnificent robe, but also the burden of the expectations of an entire country. The process is solemn, almost timeless. She takes vows, promises to serve her people, uphold the laws, and fulfill her role with dignity. They are words that she has already internalized inwardly, but at this moment they take on a new meaning. They become public, binding, and irreversible. A particularly central moment is the anointing. It is the only part of the ceremony that is not filmed, a deliberately chosen moment of intimacy in the midst of a public event. Here, Elizabeth is symbolically placed in her role, not only as a political figure, but as part of a centuries-old tradition that combines religious and state elements. When the crown is finally placed on her, the ceremony reaches its climax. This moment is more than a ritual. It is a visible sign that the young woman, who led a relatively reclusive life just a few years ago, is now finally at the center of the story. The public's reaction is overwhelming. People are celebrating, streets are decorated, an atmosphere of hope and new beginnings is in the air. After the difficult years of war and deprivation, the coronation offers a moment of unity. It is not just a royal event, it is a collective experience. For many, Elizabeth is becoming a symbol of a new generation. It is young, modern, and at the same time deeply rooted in traditions. This combination appeals to people who are looking for guidance in a changing world. The coronation thus becomes more than just the beginning of her reign. It becomes a sign that the monarchy is ready to evolve. But behind all the glamour and public enthusiasm is a personal reality that is less visible. For Elizabeth, this day also means the final end of a phase of life. The last remnants of her former identity, as a daughter, as a young wife, as a relatively private person, recede into the background. From now on, she is one thing above all, Queen. This transformation is not loud, not dramatic. It happens quietly, almost imperceptibly, but it is final. This moment is also of great importance for Prince Philip. While Elizabeth is the center of attention, he also finds his place in this new order. His role is complex. He is a supporter, companion, and at the same time someone who has to redefine his own identity in a system that does not put him at the center. But it is precisely this challenge that shows the strength of their partnership. Philip is at her side, not in the foreground, but present. His support will be crucial in the coming years, even if it often remains in the background. With the end of the coronation, a new phase officially begins. Elizabeth is no longer just queen in name. She is also queen in the full visible sense. The world has seen them, heard their words, and understood their role. Chapter 7 thus marks a decisive turning point. It is the moment when an unexpected queen becomes a recognized monarch. A moment in which tradition and modernity meet, and do not contradict each other, but complement each other. The decision to open the coronation already shows the direction in which her reign will go, respectful of the past, but not blind to the future. And it is precisely in this balance that the beginning of a new age lies. An age marked not only by events, but by an attitude, the attitude of a queen who understands that her role is not to change the world, but to give it stability. And while the crown rests on her head, a reign begins that will last longer than anyone can imagine at this moment. Chapter 8: The Commonwealth and a Changing World. The coronation of Elizabeth II marks the beginning of a new chapter not only for the British monarchy, but also for the world in which it exists. The 1950s and 1960s were marked by far-reaching changes. Old structures are dissolving, new nations are emerging, and the political map is shifting at a speed that was hardly imaginable before. At the heart of this change is a question that also redefines Elizabeth's role. What is the significance of monarchy in a world that is increasingly moving away from imperial structures? The British Empire, once a global power structure, is beginning to disintegrate. Countries in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean are striving for independence, many of them successfully. This process is not only politically but also emotionally charged. Decades, sometimes centuries, of colonial rule are coming to an end, and with them an order that has long been taken for granted. For the young queen, this means an enormous challenge. For while the power structures are changing, it remains the symbol of an institution that is closely linked to this past. The question is not whether anything will change, but how. The answer lies in the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is not an empire, not a power structure in the classical sense. It is an association of independent states linked by a common history, values, and cooperation. Some of these countries retain the monarchy as head of state, others opt for republican systems, and still remain part of this community. Elizabeth realizes early on that this is exactly where the future lies. Rather than clinging to a crumbling empire, it is beginning to strengthen the Commonwealth as a platform for cooperation, dialogue, and mutual respect. It is a fundamental change of perspective, away from control and towards connection. But this change does not happen automatically. It requires diplomatic skill, patience, and the ability to build trust. Elizabeth takes on a central role in this. She travels, visits countries, talks to heads of state and citizens. Their presence is not political in the strict sense. They do not make decisions in the classic power structure. But she creates something else: closeness. At a time when many former colonies are redefining their identity, she is becoming a constant figure, not as a ruler, but as a symbol of continuity in the midst of change. These trips are more than representative visits. They are encounters. Elizabeth takes her time, listens, shows interest in the cultures and people she visits. This attitude is often underestimated, but it has an effect. In many countries, she is perceived not only as a queen, but as someone who shows respect without exercising dominance. At the same time, it faces challenges. Not all transitions go smoothly. In some countries, there are political tensions, conflicts, and also criticism of the past. The monarchy is not seen positively everywhere. It also stands for a history that is associated with oppression for many people. Elizabeth can't change this story, but it can influence how it is handled. And this is exactly where her particular strength becomes apparent. She does not react defensively, not confrontationally, but with restraint and respect. She accepts that the world is changing and adapts her role accordingly. This ability to adapt becomes a decisive factor for the survival of the monarchy. While other institutions cling to rigid structures and lose importance, Elizabeth remains flexible, without abandoning her basic principles. It adheres to traditions where they make sense and is open to change where it seems necessary. One example of this is the increasing visibility of the Commonwealth. Under her leadership, it will become not only a political platform, but also a symbol of diversity. Countries with different cultures, languages, and political systems find common ground here. Elizabeth becomes a unifying figure, not through power, but through presence. The personal level also plays a role in this. It builds relationships, not only with heads of state, but also with local people. These encounters create trust, a factor that is often decisive in international diplomacy, but is rarely visible. In parallel with these developments, Great Britain itself is also changing. Society is becoming more diverse, open, and complex. Migration, economic change, and social changes characterize the country. The role of the monarchy is increasingly being questioned. Is it still up to date? What function does it fulfill in a modern democracy? Elizabeth does not address these questions with major reforms or radical changes. Instead, it relies on continuity. She remains present, fulfills her tasks, talks to people, and shows that her role is not to exercise power, but to provide stability. At a time when many things are uncertain, it is precisely this consistency that becomes a value. Their cooperation with political leaders is also characterized by restraint. It does not actively interfere in political decisions, adheres to the constitutional limits of its role. At the same time, she uses her position to stay informed, ask questions, and develop an understanding of the developments affecting her country and the Commonwealth. This balance, between closeness and distance, between tradition and change, is not easy. But Elizabeth manages to maintain it for years. Chapter 8 thus shows a phase of her life that is characterized less by individual events than by a continuous process. A process in which not only the world changes, but also its role within this world. She is no longer perceived only as a national monarch, but as an international figure. A queen who does not rule over an empire, but unites a community. This difference is crucial. He shows that power does not always lie in control, but also in the ability to shape relationships, build trust, and provide orientation in times of change. And that is exactly what will become one of the central elements of her reign. While old structures disappear, something new is emerging. And Elizabeth is at the center of this transition, not as a driving force in the classical sense, but as a constant presence that enables change without forcing it. Thus, Chapter 8 becomes a quiet but significant period in her story. A chapter that shows that true strength is not always loud. Rather, it often lies in adapting to a new reality and finding a new role in it. Chapter 9, Family Spotlight. With the growing obligations as monarch, Elizabeth II is increasingly at the center of the world public. But while she fulfills her role with remarkable discipline, an area of her life is developing at the same time that is just as important, and at the same time far more complex: her family. It becomes clear early on that life as a queen not only means political and representative responsibility, but also the challenge of leading a private life under permanent observation. For Elizabeth, family is not a sideshow, but a central part of her identity. But it is precisely this area that becomes one of the most difficult over the years. Together with Prince Philip, she has 4 children, Charles III, and Andrew and Edward. Each of these children grows up in a world that is privileged and restricted at the same time, shaped by tradition, expectation, and public attention. Charles, in particular, as the eldest son and direct heir to the throne, is in the spotlight early on. His childhood is very different from that of his mother. While Elizabeth grew up relatively shielded, Charles has been part of a media world from the very beginning. Every step, every decision is observed, analyzed, and evaluated. Elizabeth is faced with an inner conflict. On the one hand, she is a mother, on the other hand, she is queen. 2 roles that are not always compatible. Her obligations mean that she is often on the road, traveling, on state visits, on official appointments. Time she can spend with her children is limited. This reality is not unusual for leaders, but in the context of the monarchy, it takes on a special meaning. Because while she embodies stability as queen, her role as a mother is increasingly questioned. Charles, in particular, feels the distance. He grows up in a system that leaves little room for emotional closeness. Strict upbringing, traditional expectations, and the pressure to become king himself one day shape his development. Elizabeth observes this, but her possibilities to intervene are limited, not least because of the structure she embodies herself. And on the other hand, shows a different character early on. It is considered independent, direct, and less interested in public attention. Her relationship with her mother seems more stable in many ways, perhaps also because she is not under the same pressure of expectations as Charles. Andrew and Edward grow up in a time when the monarchy has already changed. Media presence is stronger, social norms are changing, and the public is increasingly interested in the private lives of the royal family. This development brings with it new challenges. What used to be hidden behind palace walls is now being discussed publicly. Relationships, conflicts, and personal decisions become part of a public discourse. For Elizabeth, this means that she must control not only her own role, but also that of her family, a task that is proving increasingly difficult. A particularly formative aspect of this phase is Charles's marriage. His relationship and later marriage to Diana Spencer attracts worldwide attention. Diana quickly becomes one of the most famous women in the world, charismatic, emotional, and approachable. For the public, she embodies a modern monarchy. But behind the scenes, the relationship develops differently. The marriage between Charles and Diana is marked by tensions, different expectations, and growing distance. These conflicts do not go unnoticed. Media reports, speculation arises, and the royal family is at the center of a public debate that is becoming increasingly intense. For Elizabeth, this is a difficult situation. As queen, she has to maintain neutrality. As a mother, she is emotionally involved. Decisions that she makes or does not make are interpreted and evaluated. The boundary between private and public life is becoming increasingly blurred. This development reached a peak in the 1990s. Several events shake the public perception of the monarchy. Separations, scandals, and internal conflicts become public. Elizabeth herself later described the year 1992 as an annus horribilis, a terrible year. It is a phase in which the institution she has embodied throughout her life loses trust. The public is beginning to question more critically: is the monarchy still up to date? What role does it play in a modern society? And how authentic is the image it conveys? For Elizabeth, this means a new kind of challenge. It is no longer just political stability that is required, but also emotional accessibility. People don't just want to see a queen, they want to see a human being. This expectation is in tension with her own character. Elizabeth was prepared to show restraint, not to make feelings public, and to put her role above personal needs. But now it is precisely this attitude that is sometimes perceived as distance. The events surrounding the family force her to deal with this new reality. At the same time, she remains true to her basic attitude. She does not react impulsively, not emotionally in public, but deliberately. For some, this seems cool, for others consistently. But despite all the challenges, the strength of this family is also evident. It will remain. Conflicts are resolved, mistakes are made, relationships change, but the structure is preserved. Elizabeth manages to keep the balance between stability and adaptation, even if it doesn't always go smoothly. A decisive factor here is their ability to think long-term. While individual events cause criticism in the short term, she focuses on the bigger picture. She knows that the monarchy is not defined by individual moments, but by its permanence over decades. Chapter 9 is therefore not a chapter full of clear highlights or completed developments. It is a chapter of complexity. A chapter that shows that behind the institution of the monarchy there is a family, with all its challenges, conflicts, and human sides. For Elizabeth, this means constantly switching between two roles. Between the queen, who embodies stability, and the mother, who faces personal challenges. These two levels cannot always be separated. And this is precisely one of the greatest tensions of her life. But despite all the difficulties, she remains true to her line. She fulfills her duty, maintains her composure, and tries to lead her family within a system that leaves little room for error. And perhaps this is where one of their most human sides becomes apparent. Not in perfection, but in dealing with imperfection. Because behind the crown is not only a queen, but also a mother who, like many others, tries to do the right thing, even if there are no easy answers. Chapter 10: Years of Crisis and Public Criticism. As the decades go by, not only Elizabeth II's experience grows, but also the complexity of the world in which she fulfills her role. The 1980s and especially the 1990s marked a phase in which the relationship between the monarchy and the public changed noticeably. What has long been characterized by respect, distance, and quiet acceptance is now increasingly determined by criticism, questions, and expectations. Society has changed. Media are more present, faster, and often ruthless. Information is no longer spread only through newspapers or official channels, but through a growing network of television, tabloid press, and international reporting. As a result, the royal family is under observation that has never existed in this form before. For Elizabeth, this means a new kind of challenge. She is used to fulfilling her role with restraint, not giving personal insights and placing the institution above the individual. But it is precisely this attitude that is now increasingly being questioned. The public wants to know more, see more, understand more. At the same time, events within the royal family are piling up, which further increase this attention. Her children's marriages get into trouble. Separations and conflicts are discussed publicly. Private details are leaked to the press. In particular, the relationship between Charles III and Diana Spencer is developing into a constant media topic. What once began as a fairy tale wedding is increasingly perceived as a conflictual relationship. Interviews, rumors, and revelations shape the image that the public receives. The royal family, long a symbol of stability, suddenly seems vulnerable. For Elizabeth, this development is difficult. As a queen, she has to remain neutral. As a mother, she is emotionally affected. Decisions are judged from the outside, often without insight into the actual background. Every reaction, or the lack of a reaction, is interpreted. The situation escalates further when several marriages within the family fail. The idea of a stable, near-perfect royal family is beginning to crumble. The public reacts with a mixture of fascination and criticism. The turning point of this phase is often associated with a single year, 1992. This year, events are piling up in a way that is extraordinary even for the experienced queen. Separations, scandals, and finally a devastating fire at Windsor Castle, one of the most important royal estates, characterize these months. Elizabeth herself later described this year as an annus horribilis. This expression is remarkable. It shows that she not only recognizes the heaviness of this time, but is also willing to name it publicly, albeit in her typical reserved form. The fire at Windsor Castle becomes a symbolic event. It stands not only for physical damage, but also for the fragility of an institution that has long been considered unshakable. The subsequent discussion about who should pay for the renovation costs leads to further criticism. Should the public pay? This question triggers a broad debate. Many people question the role and financing of the monarchy. At a time of economic challenges, the royal family's lifestyle no longer seems appropriate to some. Elizabeth reacts. It decides that the royal family will pay income tax in the future, a move that is seen as an adaptation to modern society. At the same time, Buckingham Palace will be partially open to the public in order to generate additional income. These measures are more than just practical decisions. They are a sign that the monarchy is ready to change, at least in certain areas. But the criticism does not stop. The media continue to report intensively on the private life of the royal family. The boundaries between public interest and personal privacy are becoming increasingly blurred. For Elizabeth, who has relied on discretion all her life, this is a fundamental change. It faces the challenge of protecting an institution that can no longer rely on the same rules as it used to. In doing so, she remains true to her line. She does not react impulsively, not emotionally in public. Instead, it focuses on stability. She fulfills her duties, continues to appear at official events, and adheres to the principles that have shaped her reign. For some, this attitude seems distant. For others, It is exactly what is needed at this time. Because while the public discussion is often loud and controversial, Elizabeth offers a constant. It does not change abruptly, but adapts gradually. This type of change is less visible, but effective in the long term. Another important aspect of this phase is the increasing internationalization of the media. Events that used to be discussed mainly nationally now reach a global audience. The British monarchy is becoming a global issue, and with it its challenges. Elizabeth must learn to deal not only with national, but also with international criticism. Her experience helps her with this. It has already experienced political upheavals, social changes, and international crises. This perspective enables her to place current events in a larger context. Chapter 10 is therefore not a chapter of stability in the classical sense. It is a chapter of burden. A period in which the monarchy reaches its limits, and at the same time has to prove that it is adaptable. For Elizabeth, this means making decisions that aren't always popular while preserving her role. It cannot do justice to everyone, but she can try to keep the balance between tradition and change, between public expectation and personal attitude. And it is precisely in this balance that her answer to the crises of this time lies. Not in radical reforms, not in quick reactions, but in the consistent continuation of its task. Because despite all the criticism, despite all the challenges, one thing remains: your presence. And perhaps it is precisely this consistency that enables the monarchy to survive this phase as well. Not unscathed, but stable enough to continue to exist. Chapter 11: The Tragedy of Diana. In the years following the crises of the early 1990s, the British monarchy remains in a delicate balance. The trust of the public can no longer be taken for granted. The media landscape remains critical and attentive. In the midst of this tense situation, a moment occurs that changes everything, not only for the royal family, but for an entire country: the death of Diana Spencer. Diana has long been more than just a member of the royal family. Since her marriage to Charles III, she has become a global icon. Her charisma, her closeness to the people, and her openness make her a figure that has an impact far beyond the traditional borders of the monarchy. For many, she embodies a new kind of royal presence: emotional, accessible, and authentic. But it is precisely these characteristics that often contrast with the institution to which she belongs. The marriage between Diana and Charles eventually breaks up, and the separation becomes public. Interviews, reports, and personal testimonies reinforce the image of a deep conflict, not only between two people, but also between individual personality and institutional expectations. After the divorce, Diana remains in the public eye. She continues to be involved in humanitarian projects, has a presence on international issues, and remains one of the most respected women in the world. At the same time, she pursues a life that is increasingly independent of the royal family. On August 31, 1997, the inconceivable happened. Diana dies in a car accident in Paris. The news spreads at incredible speed. Within a few hours, the whole world is informed. Shock, grief, and bewilderment are spreading. People gather in front of Buckingham Palace, lay flowers, light candles. The streets of London become places of collective mourning. For many, it is not just the death of a well-known personality. It is the loss of a symbol. At this moment, Diana becomes something that goes beyond her real person. It stands for compassion for humanity, for a connection between the monarchy and the population that has rarely been so intense. And this is exactly where one of the most difficult phases for Elizabeth II begins. At the time of Diana's death, the royal family is in Balmoral, one of their retreats in Scotland. Elizabeth decides to stay there, mainly to offer protection to her grandchildren, the sons of Diana and Charles. In a situation characterized by media interest and public pressure, she wants to give them space to grieve. This decision is understandable from her perspective, but she is perceived differently by the public. Many people expect an immediate, visible reaction. A speech, a sign of sympathy, a presence in London. The lack of this reaction leads to growing criticism. At this moment, the monarchy seems distant, perhaps even unapproachable. The mood in the country is changing. Grief is mixed with incomprehension. Why doesn't the Queen show emotions? Why does it stay in the background? These questions are becoming increasingly loud. The media pick up on them, discussions arise, and the relationship between the monarchy and the population reaches a critical point. For Elizabeth, this is an extraordinarily difficult situation. She stands between two roles: the grandmother, who wants to protect her family, and the Queen, who is supposed to act publicly. Both roles require different decisions, and can hardly be reconciled at this moment. But with the growing criticism, it is becoming clear that a reaction is necessary. Elizabeth returns to London. It is a decisive step. When they arrive, a new form of presence is revealed. She steps in front of the people, looks at the flowers that have been laid in front of the palace, and shows herself visibly. They are not grand gestures, no emotional outbursts, but it is a sign that she perceives the mood in the country. The highlight of this phase is her televised address to the nation. In this speech, she talks about Diana, not only as a public figure, but also as a mother and human being. She pays tribute to her commitment, her personality, and the connection she had with the people. It is an unusual moment. Elizabeth, who is otherwise known for her restraint, shows a more personal side here. Her words are carefully chosen, but they carry an emotional depth that is rarely visible in this form. For many people, this speech is a turning point. Criticism decreases, understanding grows. The monarchy seems closer again, not perfect, but more human. Diana's funeral becomes one of the most haunted events in history. Millions of people around the world watch as a life that has touched so many is bid farewell. Elizabeth also takes part in the ceremony. A particularly symbolic moment is when she lowers her head slightly as Diana's coffin is carried past Buckingham Palace. This gesture, as small as it may seem, is interpreted by many as a sign of respect and recognition. Chapter 11 thus shows not only a tragedy, but also a phase of change. The events surrounding Diana's death make it clear that expectations of the monarchy have changed. People want not only stability, but also emotional connection. Elizabeth recognizes this. Not immediately, not without hesitation, but ultimately clear. She begins to look at her role in this context in a new way. Without abandoning its basic principles, it adapts certain aspects. At certain moments, it becomes more visible, more accessible, and reacts more sensitively to public moods. This adaptation is not a break with their past, but a further development. Because the strength of her reign does not lie in remaining unchanged, but in adapting at crucial moments without losing her own identity. Diana's tragedy remains a formative moment. For the family, for the country, and for Elizabeth herself. It shows how closely personal fates and public perception are linked. And it makes it clear that even an institution like the monarchy is not outside of social developments. There is no simple solution at the end of this chapter, but an understanding. An understanding that leadership is not only defined by decisions, but also by the ability to listen, learn, and develop. And perhaps this is exactly the most important lesson from this time. That even a queen who has dedicated her life to duty has to relearn at certain moments what this duty means. Chapter 12: Modernization of the Monarchy. After the profound upheavals of the 1990s, Elizabeth II faces a crucial task. The monarchy must change without losing its identity. The events surrounding the death of Diana Spencer have made it clear that public expectations have changed. People don't just want to see an institution, they want closeness, transparency, and a certain degree of humanity. For Elizabeth, this means a balancing act. It is shaped by a generation in which restraint, discipline, and distance are considered essential for the dignity of the monarchy. But the world around her has changed. Media have become faster, more direct, and more personal. Information spreads in real time, and the public expects reactions just as quickly. The question is no longer whether the monarchy has to adapt, but how. Elizabeth does not decide to make a radical break with the past. Instead, it is pursuing a path of gradual change. Small adjustments, targeted openings, and conscious decisions characterize this phase. A central element of this modernization is increasing transparency. Already after the crises of the early 1990s, the first steps were taken, such as the opening of Buckingham Palace to visitors or the decision to pay taxes on personal income. But now it continues. Communication will be adjusted. Official appearances are staged more strongly in order to establish a connection with the public. The royal family is more likely to appear in more informal contexts, participate in events that are closer to people's everyday lives, and are more sensitive to social issues. These changes are not spectacular. They happen quietly, almost inconspicuously, and that's exactly where their effect lies. Because Elizabeth understands that stability doesn't mean leaving everything unchanged. It means shaping changes in such a way that they are not perceived as a rupture, but as a development. Another important aspect is the use of media. The relationship between the monarchy and the press was long marked by distance. But this distance is no longer tenable. Instead of completely isolating itself, the royal family is beginning to work more specifically with the media. Interviews, documentaries, and controlled insights into royal life become part of the strategy. The aim is not to reveal everything, but to convey a balanced picture, one that shows both the institution and the people behind it. Elizabeth remains true to her line. She herself rarely appears in a personal context, avoids emotional openness in public, and maintains a certain restraint. But it allows other members of the family to take on a more modern role. This is particularly evident in the next generation. Charles III begins to set his own priorities, for example in the area of the environment and sustainability. His views are partly unconventional, but they show that the monarchy is willing to deal with current issues. Younger members of the family are also increasingly making an appearance. They use new communication channels, talk more openly about personal topics, and thus reach an audience that can identify more strongly with them. This development would hardly be possible without the foundation that Elizabeth creates. At the same time, the structure of the monarchy is also changing. The role of individual members is more clearly defined, tasks are distributed in a more targeted manner, and there is a greater focus on efficiency. The idea of a leaner monarchy emerges, fewer members at the center, but clearer responsibilities. This adjustment is also a reaction to public discussions. The question of the financing and benefits of the monarchy remains present. Elizabeth does not respond to this criticism with confrontation, but with adaptation. It shows that the institution is willing to question and develop itself. Another important step is the greater integration of social issues. The royal family is involved in areas such as charity, education, health, and social projects. These activities are not new, but they are being communicated more visibly, in a more targeted manner and in the foreground. Elizabeth herself remains a symbol of continuity. While many things are changing around her, she remains constant in her attitude. Her speeches, her appearances, and her way of communicating are characterized by calm and clarity. It does not react to every trend, not to every criticism, but consciously chooses when and how it expresses itself. This restraint is increasingly perceived as a strength. In a world characterized by quick opinions and constant change, it offers a form of stability that many people appreciate. But this phase is not without challenges. Modernization also entails risks. More openness means more attack surface. More visibility leads to more criticism. The balance between transparency and privacy remains a sensitive issue. Elizabeth meets these challenges with experience. She knows that not every decision is accepted immediately, that changes take time, and that the effect often only becomes visible in the long term. This patience is a crucial factor in the success of their strategy. Chapter 12 thus shows a monarchy in transition. Not revolutionary, not abrupt, but evolutionary. It is a process characterized by adaptation, observation, and targeted decisions. A process that shows that even an institution with centuries of tradition is capable of developing further. For Elizabeth, this phase means a new form of leadership, not only through presence, but also through creating framework conditions in which change is possible. It remains at the center, but it allows the monarchy to move around it. And this is precisely where their particular strength lies. She doesn't have to change everything herself. It creates the stability that makes change possible. Thus, Chapter 12 becomes an important period of her reign. A period in which it becomes clear that modernization does not mean leaving the past behind, but leading it into a new era. And as the world continues to change, Elizabeth remains what she has always been: a fixed point in an eventful time. Except that this point is now part of a monarchy that has learned to change with the world, without losing itself. Chapter 13, a symbol of stability. Over the decades, the world is changing faster than ever before. Political systems are changing, societies are evolving, technologies are revolutionizing people's everyday lives. And while all these changes are taking place, one constant remains: Elizabeth II. With age and experience, their role becomes clearer than ever. She is no longer just a monarch, she is a symbol of permanence in a world that is constantly reinventing itself. This special position does not arise overnight. It is the result of decades of consistent attitude, of countless decisions, appearances, and encounters. Elizabeth has witnessed wars, political upheavals, social revolutions, and technological changes, and she remains present in all these phases. Especially in times of uncertainty, this presence becomes particularly important. People are looking for orientation. You're looking for something that stays while everything else changes. And it is precisely this role that Elizabeth fulfills, not through active political influence, but through her mere existence as a constant figure. A central part of this role is its cooperation with the prime ministers of Great Britain. In the course of her reign, she met an exceptionally large number of political leaders. From Winston Churchill to modern office holders, it has witnessed generations of political change. Every week, she holds talks with the respective prime minister, confidentially, regularly, and independently of political currents. These meetings are a unique part of the British system. Elizabeth does not give political instructions, does not make direct decisions. But it listens, asks questions, and offers a perspective based on decades of experience. Their role is subtle, but not insignificant. It is a kind of silent anchor. While governments come and go, it remains. This continuity creates a sense of stability, both within the UK and internationally. This role is also visible at the global level. Elizabeth meets heads of state, diplomats, and international personalities. Their presence often has a connecting effect. Their experience is respected. In a world where political relations are complex and sometimes tense, it offers a form of neutral constancy. In doing so, she always remains true to her line. It does not comment publicly on political conflicts, avoids clear positions, and adheres to the limits of its constitutional role. This restraint is not a sign of passivity, but a conscious decision. Because this is exactly how it preserves its independence. She does not belong to any political direction, does not represent a party, does not pursue her own agenda. This neutrality makes her a figure who stands above political conflicts, and that is precisely where her strength lies. At the same time, the perception of the monarchy continues to change. While previous generations saw her primarily as an institution, she is now increasingly perceived as a personal figure. Elizabeth is not only seen as a queen, but as a human being, with history, experience, and a clear attitude. This development is particularly visible in times of crisis. Whether national challenges or global events, in moments of uncertainty, the focus is often on them. Their speeches, their words, and their presence take on a special meaning. An example of this is her Christmas speeches. Year after year, she speaks to people, reflects on past events, and looks to the future. These speeches are not a political tool, but a personal moment, an attempt to connect. Over time, these talks become an integral part of many lives. They are familiar, predictable, and that's exactly where their value lies. Another important aspect of this phase is her increasing role as a historical figure. With every year that passes, it becomes a link between past and present. She has experienced events that are only history for younger generations. This perspective makes them unique. She is not only part of the story, she embodies it. At the same time, it remains open to change. The world is digitizing, communication is becoming faster, new generations are coming to the fore. Elizabeth adapts without giving up her basic principles. It uses new technologies, appears in modern contexts, and shows that tradition and progress do not have to be mutually exclusive. This ability to adapt is crucial, because it shows that stability does not mean stagnation, but the ability to move without losing one's own direction. Even within her family, her role is increasingly that of a central figure. While younger members are breaking new ground, it remains the common point of reference. Their experience, their attitude, and their presence provide orientation, even in difficult times. Their influence is often indirect. It does not actively intervene, does not give public instructions. But her attitude works, through example, through continuity, and through the way she fulfills her role. Chapter 13 is therefore not a chapter of great events. It is a chapter of impact. A phase in which it becomes clear that true meaning does not always lie in visible decisions, but in long-term presence. In the ability to fulfill a constant role over decades, regardless of external changes. Elizabeth becomes more than just a monarch during this time. It becomes a symbol of stability, of a sense of duty, and of the idea that certain values can endure even in a changing world. This role also brings responsibility. Because the more it is perceived as a symbol, the greater the expectations. Mistakes are less forgiven, decisions are observed more closely. But Elizabeth also meets this challenge with the same attitude that has characterized her entire reign. With calm, with discipline, and with a deep understanding of their task. At the end of this chapter, there is no spectacular change, but a realization that stability is not loud, that it does not come about through grand gestures, but through constancy, and that it is precisely this consistency that makes Elizabeth II one of the most formative figures of her time. While the world continues to turn, it remains not unchanged, but constant enough to provide orientation. And perhaps this is exactly their greatest achievement. Not to change the world, but to give it support in decisive moments. Chapter 14, The Platinum Jubilee and its Legacy. 7 decades on the throne, a period of time that goes far beyond what anyone could have imagined at the beginning of her reign. As Elizabeth II celebrates her Platinum Jubilee in 2022, she is not only the longest reigning monarch in British history, but also one of the world's most recognizable and enduring figures. 70 years. This number stands not only for permanence, but for an extraordinary continuity in a world that is changing at an ever faster pace. As generations come and go, as political systems change and societal values redefine themselves, Elizabeth remains a constant presence. The Platinum Jubilee becomes a global event. Celebrations are taking place in Great Britain and throughout the Commonwealth. Parades, concerts, official ceremonies, and spontaneous actions by the population show how deeply their reign is anchored in the collective consciousness. People of all ages take part. Some remember her early years as a queen, others know her only as the only monarch of their lives. This cross-generational connection is unique. For many, Elizabeth is not just a historical figure, but a part of their personal lives. She was there when her parents were young, when they themselves grew up, and when their children were born. This continuity creates an emotional closeness that goes beyond political or institutional significance. But behind the celebrations, there is also a quiet reality. Elizabeth is an older woman at this point. The years have left their mark, their public appearances are becoming rarer, their movements more cautious. The responsibility she has borne for decades has not disappeared, but it is changing. It delegates more tasks, transfers responsibility to the next generation. Charles III in particular comes more to the fore. He takes on more official appointments, represents the monarchy on important occasions, and visibly prepares for his future role. This transition does not happen abruptly. It is the result of a long process in which Elizabeth gradually creates space. It remains present, but it enables others to take responsibility. This form of transition is deliberately chosen. It is intended to ensure stability and continuity at the same time. The Platinum Jubilee will thus also be a moment of pause. Not only a look back at what was, but also a look into the future. What will remain? What will change? What role will the monarchy play in the coming decades? These questions are in the room, even if they are not always openly expressed. Elizabeth herself only comments on this indirectly. In her messages, she emphasizes gratitude, a sense of duty, and the importance of serving the people. These are words that reflect her entire reign. Words that show that their understanding of leadership is not based on power, but on responsibility. Her legacy becomes increasingly visible at this stage. It does not lie in individual decisions or spectacular events, but in the sum of their attitude. In the way she has fulfilled her role over decades, constantly, disciplined, and without the claim to be the center of attention. This attitude has shaped the monarchy. She has given it a form that is both traditional and adaptable. An institution that can change without losing its identity. And this is exactly where one of her greatest achievements lies. But her legacy goes beyond the monarchy. She becomes a historical figure whose importance is measured not only by her position, but also by her impact. In the way it has influenced people, how it has given orientation in difficult times, and how it has been present across generations. For many people, it is a symbol of stability. For others, an example of a sense of duty. And for some, it may also be a reminder that leadership doesn't always have to be loud to be effective. The Platinum Jubilee makes all these aspects visible. It is a moment of recognition, not only from the official side, but also from the population. People show their appreciation in a variety of ways, by participating in celebrations, through personal words, or simply through their presence. This connection between monarch and people is not a matter of course. It is the result of a long process in which trust has been built, through consistency, through presence, and through the ability to stand firm even in difficult times. At the same time, Elizabeth remains true to her line to the end. It does not place itself at the center of the celebrations, does not seek the big stage. Instead, she remains reserved, lets others speak, and concentrates on what has always been in the foreground for her, her duty. Chapter 14 is therefore not a classic chapter with clear turning points. It is a chapter of reflection. A section that shows what has grown over decades. A moment in which past and present collide, and a picture emerges that goes far beyond individual events. Elizabeth II becomes something at this moment that only a few people succeed in. To a living legend. But even this term only describes part of its meaning. Because her legacy lies not only in the duration of her reign, but in the way she shaped this time. In the consistency with which she fulfilled her role. And in the calmness with which she allowed change without giving up her basic principles. As the festivities slowly fade away, this legacy remains. Not as a closed chapter, but as the basis for what will follow. Because even though her time is coming to an end, what she has built up continues to have an effect. In the monarchy, in society, and in the memory of the people who have accompanied her for decades. Chapter 14 thus ends not with a farewell, but with a transition. A transition from an active regency to a legacy that will last far beyond the time when she herself was at the center. Chapter 15, Farewell and Historical Significance. At the end of a long life, there is not only the moment of farewell, but also the question of what remains. For Elizabeth II, this moment is not only personal, but historic. Because when a reign spans more than 7 decades, it doesn't just end a life, it ends an entire era. In the last years of her life, Elizabeth increasingly withdraws from the public eye. Their appearances are becoming rarer, their physical strength is declining. But even in this phase, it remains present, not through frequent apparitions, but through what it has built up over decades. Her words, her attitude, and her role continue to have an effect. The world around her has continued to change during this time. New political challenges are emerging, social debates are increasing, and the monarchy continues to be the focus of public discussion. But Elizabeth remains a constant figure until the end. Even in her last public moments, this consistency is evident. Just a few days before her death, she receives a new prime minister, fulfilling her constitutional duties and thus showing that her duty never ends for her. It is a quiet but significant expression of what has shaped her entire life, the willingness to take responsibility, regardless of personal circumstances. She died on September 8, 2022, at the age of 96. The news spreads around the world within minutes. Governments, institutions, and people from different countries react with grief and respect. For many, it is a moment of pause, a moment in which it becomes clear that something has come to an end that seemed to be taken for granted for decades. In Great Britain, a phase of national mourning begins. People gather in front of Buckingham Palace, lay flowers, write messages, stand together in silence. They are scenes that are reminiscent of earlier moments, and yet have a different meaning. Because this time it is not about a single event. It's about the end of an era. The grief is characterized by gratitude, respect, and the realization that Elizabeth was more than a monarch for many people. She was a part of her life, a fixed point in a changing world. Internationally, too, the reaction is extraordinary. Heads of state, politicians, and personalities from all over the world speak out. They speak of stability, of a sense of duty, and of a unique presence that has worked over generations. This worldwide resonance shows how far their influence reached. Not through political decisions, not through power in the classical sense, but through the way it has fulfilled its role. With her death, the crown passes to her son, Charles III. The transition is immediate. Just as Elizabeth once became queen herself without a transitional period, Charles is now taking on the role of monarch. The continuity of the monarchy is preserved, a principle that has endured for centuries. But despite this continuity, it is clear that something has changed. Charles not only succeeds his mother, but also a legacy that is extraordinary. A reign that lasted so long, was so constant, and included so many historic moments cannot simply be continued. It shapes the expectations of everything that follows. Elizabeth's funeral becomes an event of global importance. People from all over the world follow the ceremony. Heads of state will travel, representatives of various nations will take part. The processes are characterized by tradition, symbolism, and a dignity that reflects her entire reign. It is a farewell that corresponds to her role. Not loudly, not spectacularly, but carried by respect and history. The silence is particularly impressive. The moments when no words are spoken, when only presence counts. They reflect what Elizabeth has embodied for decades, a form of leadership defined not by volume, but by consistency. Chapter 15 isn't just a farewell chapter, though. It is also a chapter of classification. What does such a regency mean in a historical context? How will Elizabeth II be remembered? The answers to these questions are complex. She was not the monarch of great political decisions. It has not made any laws, implemented no direct political measures. And yet her influence was felt, in the way she created stability, how she built trust, and how she was present for decades. Their importance does not lie in individual moments, but in the sum of their actions, in the consistency with which she has fulfilled her role, in the ability to adapt to a changing world without losing its basic principles. Historically, it is often seen as a connection between different eras. She experienced the aftermath of the Second World War, the Cold War, the collapse of the Empire, digitization, and globalization. She was part of all these developments, not as an active designer, but as a constant observer and companion. This perspective makes them unique. She is a figure who has not only experienced history, but has shaped it through her presence. The role of the monarchy itself has also changed as a result of it. It has shown that an institution that is deeply rooted in the past can adapt, that tradition and modernity do not have to be a contradiction, and that stability has its own value in a changing world. For many people, she will therefore not only be remembered as a queen, but as a symbol of a sense of duty, of consistency, and of the idea that leadership can also be quiet. Chapter 15 does not end with a definitive answer. Because Elizabeth II's legacy will continue to evolve, in the way she is talked about, in the role of the monarchy, and in people's memory. But one thing remains clear. She has left a trace that is not defined by individual events, but by the duration and attitude with which it has fulfilled its role. And perhaps this is precisely its greatest historical significance, that it has shown how much impact can be made in constance. In a world that is constantly changing, she was what remains. And that's exactly where her legacy lies.